I'll start off with a couple of previous questions, like one question I think in the second lecture that I sort of made a mistake in writing the formula. And then I will do one electronics question like I promised. And then I will move on to the 15 questions set for today, okay? So let's look at this. Just a second. Okay. So I think I discussed about this in the second lecture. The probability current density for an unnormalized wave function psi is equal to exponential of I kx. So the thing is that the answer wasn't 0 actually. The answer is supposed to be B. Okay, so I will look at this and I will tell you what I made. I think in the last time I kind of made a mistake in this. I put a del, I took a divergence of this whole term. So that's not there. It's just the gradient of these functions that are there. Okay, so not just that, if you look at this, this is a plane wave function. So you should be able to realize that there is going to be a velocity term in the probability current density. So let's look at a rework of that. And what happens is I think I put a divergence here. So then this whole term became 0. So there's no divergence here now. So I get a h cross k divided by m. Okay, so just correct that part. Okay, so now I will move on to this. Okay, so what I've decided is as we go along, I will probably elaborate on DAC a little more. DAC is basically digital to analog converter. But for now, just remember this formula, okay? So resolution can basically be expressed in terms of two quantities, okay? So you can express it as a percentage, or you can express it as a, okay, so you can have a percentage, or you can express it in terms of voltage, okay, based on the input voltage that is given to you. So now what is given to us here is the resolution of a 16-bit DAC with 10 volt input voltage is, okay, so what is the input voltage for that? Okay, so we look at the options. Okay, so basically this is a very simple thing to do. What you do is you just have to take the voltage that is given to you, your input voltage, and divide it by 2 power the number of bits. So you'll realize after you do the calculation that you're going to get something like 0.15. Okay, so let's look at the explanation for it. So the resolution of a D2A converter is defined as the smallest change that can occur in the analog output. So basically you're converting it from a digital to an analog form. So what is the output? The output is an analog form as a result of the change in digital input. Okay, so the resolution in volts can be written in this way. So you've got a V divided by 2 power n, where n is the number of bits and V is the full scale output voltage. Sometimes they're going to give you the step size. Okay, sometimes they'll end up giving you a step size. So accordingly, there are different variants of these resolutions, which I think I decided to make a formula sheet along with this later on after the end of all the 5 papers. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, for now, just remember these two formulas. One is resolution in volts, and the other one, this is the calculation for that. So it's simple calculation, 10 divided by 2 power 16. So another thing I realized is in the case set questions, they don't really allow you to use a calculator. So I suggest you don't do the calculations using a calculator, but rather by hand. Okay. Okay. So now the next one is the resolution in percentage. Okay, this is not something that they've asked for. They've asked for a resolution in volts, and you should know that looking at the options. So all the options are given to you in volts here. Okay, so you should know that looking at the options. So here you take this. Okay, so this is the resolution in percentage. You do not put in the volts here. Okay, so you just do 1 divided by 2 power n, and then you get this. Okay, so now we come to the set for today. If A mu and B gamma are components of a contravariant and covariant vectors, what is the nature of the quantity of A mu B gamma? Okay, so A mu and B gamma. How do you know if it's variant or contravariant? So basically you're going to have a superscript in the case of your contravariant. Okay, so how I remember this is basically you have a contra, you have a T, so the superscript is going to be on the top. Okay, so you don't have many T's except at the last one. So the more the number of T's, the top is going to be. Okay, just a second. Okay. Okay, so let's look at the nature of this quantity. So what is A mu B gamma? So basically this is referred to as your outer product. Okay, outer product, or you can also okay, so you can, what you can do here is you can count the number of superscripts or subscripts that you have. Basically that's going to give you the rank of the whole thing. Okay, so what I will do here is I will show you what the options are. Okay, is it 0, is it an invariant, contravariant tensor, or a mixed tensor of rank 2? Okay, so some people, they end up choosing an invariant because they think that the contravariant and covariant vectors basically cancel each other. They immediately end up choosing an invariant. So that's not how it works. This is basically a product of two tensors. Okay, so you're looking at the outer product of two tensors. There is also another variant called the inner product. We're not discussing that right now. So you're looking at the outer product of two tensors. So the outer multiplication of two tensors is going to be given to you in this way. Okay, so if you basically have a tensor which has two contravariant components and one covariant component, and then you multiply it with another tensor with one contravariant component and one covariant component, you end up having a sum of all those components over here. So you have a P, R, M, and QS. Okay, so now let's look at this. What was given to you was an A mu B gamma. So your product is going to look like this. So there's one with a contravariant order and the other with a covariant order. Okay, so a contravariant order of 1 and a covariant order of 1. So your rank is basically the sum of those two things. So you have a mixed tensor here. So it's not entirely contravariant or entirely covariant. It's a mixed tensor. So you have a tensor of rank 2. Okay, so a mixed tensor of rank 2, that is the last option that you have. Okay. Now, this is a really interesting thing called the Ricci tensor. Okay, it's called it has huge applications in GR, your general relativity. Okay, so here this question is not very correctly framed. Okay, so they're asking you what this quantity is, G mu R. Okay, so let's look at what the Ricci tensor actually means, and then I go on to showing you the formulas, because otherwise there's no real meaning into actually doing these questions. You don't even know what it is. I just give you a couple of formulas and you write the answer. So you really don't know what's happening here unless I explain to you what it is. Okay, so is it a vector, is it a scalar, is it a pseudo scalar, and you don't even know what these options mean. Okay, so you have a scalar curvature and all that coming up. Okay, so here the question is wrongly framed. Okay, so what is the meaning of your Ricci curvature tensor or your Ricci scalar? Okay, that's what you're looking at. So there's this thing called the Riemann curvature tensor. So let's just put it there for now. Okay, let's not go too much into it, but I will explain to you what these two mean. Okay, so these two things basically sum up what this Riemann curvature tensor actually described to you. Okay, so what does it do? Okay, so basically you see there's a rabbit here. Okay, so these lines are basically geodesics. What is a geodesic? It's basically the shortest distance between 2 points, okay, in a curved surface. Okay, so let's look at this bunny here. Okay, there's this rabbit that's placed here, and if it's traveling along it, basically the volume keeps changing. Okay, so if it's going up, the volume keeps decreasing. If it's in the middle, it increases. And then what does this tensor basically do is what we're going to look at. So the Ricci tensor tracks your volume changes along the geodesic, and this has huge significance because it basically tells you how these volume changes affect two things. Okay, so I will describe to you how these volume changes are of relevance. Okay, so let's move on to, okay, so this is, I told you what a geodesic means. The shortest possible line between 2 points is your geodesic. Okay, so what is your Ricci scalar? There are two things here that I've mentioned. One is your Ricci curvature tensor. What does the tensor do? It tracks the volume changes. Okay, now what is your Ricci scalar? It is a number that is used to compare the volume of a ball. Say you have an object in curved space, and then you have the same ball in flat space. So you obviously realize that, okay, so I have something in flat space here. Okay, so I've got a circle in flat space. And now if I have something in a curved space, okay, and if I have the same circle that's drawn here, you realize that there is a certain volume change here. Okay, so it's going to be more. So the area of this is quite, like, say it's something like pi r square, but when you calculate the area of this surface, it's like an inverted bowl sorts of. And you're going to realize that the area of this projects is going to be more. Okay, so now what do we have here? Okay, so basically what does the Ricci tensor do? The Ricci tensor in your general relativity, it represents gravity. So I will tell you a little example of how these things can actually represent gravity. Okay, so not exactly, but kind of like directs you to that point. Okay, so the more space-time is curved, the more the bodies will get drawn together at a particular point. And what do you have here? So in general relativity, gravitational attraction here is basically a natural result. Okay, so if you look in Newtonian mechanics, what does your gravity basically have to do with? It's like an effect of the force. Okay, because you have a force, you have a gravity. It's something like that. Okay, rather than having it come out as a natural result of this space-time curvature that you have. Okay, so now let's look at this. So basically you have a person A here, okay, and you have a person B here. And now these two people are traveling. So there is going to be a certain, let me just keep drawing these circles along. Okay, so now this circle basically helps you track the volume change in between these two people. And what does it basically do? It tells you how far do these people have to like travel to reach this particular volume. So what is this volume being represented by? It's represented by your Ricci tensor. Okay, so now the change in this volume will tell you when these people will reach at this point, at the stop. Okay, so it will tell you when these two people will reach at this point. So the Ricci tensor in effect tells you when they will reach here. Okay, so now what did we look at? Let's just go back a bit. Okay, so we looked at this, which said that in general relativity, it represents gravity. And the gravity is okay, so the more space-time is curved, the more quickly the bodies will be drawn together. So it will tell me when people will come together at that point, right? That's what I told you before. So it's something to do with this idea that, you know, the Ricci tensor represents gravity in your general relativity. Okay. So now let's look at the definitions of this. So the scalar curvature, or your Ricci tensor, is defined like this. You have an R is equal to summation of I is equal to 1 to n, summation of k is equal to 1 to n, GIK. Okay, so remember, I don't know if you've learned this, but I certainly did it in the tensor course that was taught to me at BU. So here, basically, you end up having something called a metric. Okay, it's called a metric tensor, and then you multiply that with the tensor. So basically, this is going to be a tensor quantity itself. Okay, and then you end up getting your scalar product here, or your scalar curvature, your Ricci scalar. And then this is how your Ricci curvature tensor is defined to you. Okay, so now where your GIK is supposed to be a metric tensor. So let's go back to the question now. Okay, so now let's look at this question. What does it say? For the Ricci tensor R mu R, what is the quantity G mu R in the summation convention? So I think the answer key is wrong. They had mentioned scalar. It's not a scalar. It's supposed to be a tensor itself. Okay. So now you know what your scalar curvature means. What is the another name for your scalar curvature? It's basically also known as your Ricci scalar. Okay, and it's depicted by R, denoted by R. Okay. So let's move to the next question. Okay, So the value of integral from 0 to 1 dx divided by 1 plus x by Simpson's rule. So again, there's a problem with this. They haven't specified what Simpson's rule, if it's 1 by third or 3 by 8. So the thing is that if you get such questions, I think it's better to actually like solve them if it's solvable using the method of substitution. So what you can do here is basically you can say let your u be equal to 1 plus x. Okay, so what do you have? Your du is equal to dx. This is called the method of substitution, right? I'm sure you pretty much would know about it. So now the thing to be careful about is don't just write 0 to 1. Okay, you have to be careful about your limits. So what do you have? If you have u is equal to 1 plus x, so this is going to be a 1. Okay, so what is your u? You're changing your variables from x to u, right? So this is going to be 1, and you have a 1 plus 1, which is going to be a 2. Okay, so you have a dx divided by 1 plus x. And what is that going to give you? So you have a du divided by u. Okay, so what's the integral of that? So you should get a ln of u, and the limits would be from 1 to 2. Since your ln of 1 is 0, you can write ln of 2. Okay, so this one has a value of something like 0.69315. Okay, so it's good to remember this because this is a common thing that is used, and your log tables are not given to you, calculators are not given to you. So I think you should best remember this value of ln 2. So how I remember it is because this is 6, 9, and 3. Okay, so basically they're multiples of 3. Okay, I can remember 6, 9, and 3. And then if I add 6 and 9, I end up getting 15. Okay, so add these two numbers, you end up getting your 50. So that's how I remember this. Now let's look at the answers. So these are the answers that are given to you. The answers given is option C. Okay, and now what I will tell you is, okay, so this is working it out using the method of substitution rather than using your Simpson's rule, because they really haven't specified what it is. Okay, so these are questions that you can really challenge. You can say this wasn't specified, so you're supposed to give us grace marks and things like that. So I don't think they challenged it that year. They just left it that way. So yeah, so that's how you get this value. Now I'll just discuss these formulas, Simpson's 1/3 formula and Simpson's 3/8 formula, because they are very frequently used, something that's supposed to be known. Okay, so your integral from a to b, f of x dx. Okay, so if you're looking at your 1/3 formula, you have a h divided by 3. Now, what do you do here? You take your first term. Okay, so what is y? Y is basically your f of x. Okay, so you're supposed to be calculating, you basically divide it into a set of intervals, right? So if you have something like, say from, say you have a as 0 and b as 1. Okay, you basically divide it into a couple of intervals, something like, say if your n is equal to, let's say 5. Okay, so you divide from 0 to 1 by 5. So what do you end up getting? You get a 0.2. But you have to start off with a 0. So this would be your y0. Don't start off with a y1. Start off with a y0. Then you have a y1, for which you can substitute this into the function, and then you calculate it. So I have a couple of people, I know a couple of people who've written this as y1 and proceeded with that. So just be careful about those things. This formula is fairly simple to remember. So what do you have here? You have your Simpson's 1/3 formula. You have a h divided by 3. And you take the first one and you take the last one and you write it there and don't multiply anything with it. Then you take all the set of odd ones and multiply it with a 4. Okay, you take the set of even ones and you multiply it with a 2. Now in your Simpson's 3/8 formula, the 3/8 is already there in this. Okay, so you can just remember that way. And then what do you have? You have a y0 and you have a yn. So the first and the last values of your function. And then you take your 3, multiply it with all the things that are not multiples of 3. Okay, take a 2 and multiply it with all the things that are multiples of 3. So this is a 3, this is a 6, this is a 9, till about n minus 3. All the rest which are not multiples of 3 come up here. Okay, and those are multiplied by 3. Okay, so let's compare these two. You have a 4 here, you have a 3 here. But these two are not the same. Here it's representing odd numbers. Here it's representing everything except multiples of 3. Here you have even numbers, which is multiplied by 2. And here you have multiples of 3 which are multiplied by 2. Okay, so let's just go on. Okay, so this is something that's new. I don't think you would have learned it in your BSc or even in the mathematical methods that you're doing. So the order of error in your Simpson's rule for numerical integration with with step size h is, now what is your step size? Your step size is basically b minus a divided by n. So b and a are the limits of your intervals, and n is the number of intervals that you have, right? So now let's look at this. Okay, what are the options that are given to you? Is it h, h squared, h cubed, h power 4? So there's something called the error bounds formula. So when you're doing these methods like the Simpson's rule, trapezoidal rule, or there's another rule called the midpoint rule. Okay, these three rules are basically used to calculate your integrals. Now, what do you do when you're calculating these integrals? You're approximating the area under the curve. So what is your integral? Your area, integral is basically the area under the curve. You're approximating these area under the curve, and you want to know how okay is that value, okay? How much error is permissible for me. So the error bounds formula is something that tells you about the maximum limit of error permissible. Okay, so I will move onto the slide now. So, okay, so the midpoint rule and your trapezoidal rule and all those things are basically approximations for the area under the curve. No? Now, how do we know how approximate that value is? Is basically you want to look at something called the error bounds formula. Okay, so you're looking at the maximum possible error in your approximations, and then yeah, so if your error is very large, your error bound is very large, you know that it's a bad value that you've got. And if your error bound is very small, it's a pretty good value that you've got. Okay, so this is the error bounds formula for the Simpson's rule. Okay, so in this case, you have to calculate the fourth derivative of the function. Okay, so your Simpson's rule, you need to calculate the fourth derivative of the function, and the value of k will be given to you. Okay, and then you will be able to calculate the error bound for your Simpsons. So this is how your error bound for your Simpsons is given to you. ES is less than or equal to k into b minus a whole power 5 divided by 180 whole power n. So now what was asked in the question? What was asked in the question is, what order is your error of? Just a second. What was asked in the question is the order of error in your Simpson's rule. Okay, and they've given a step size h. So now what you need to do is you need to take this formula that you've got here, and you need to substitute the value of your step size. Okay, so you have a b minus a whole power 5 divided by n power 4. So how do you convert that? You just have to k divided by 180, this thing h power 4 into b minus a. So how is the error going to vary for the Simpson's rule? It's going to be varying of the order of this. Okay, so h power 4 of this order. So the answer is, what is the answer? The answer is option D. Okay, the answer is option D. So let's move on to the next one. Okay, before that, I want to not just do the thing for the error bound of Simpson's rule. I want to talk about a little bit about the trapezoidal as well as your midpoint formula. So the rules are quite common. We've done it all in BSc, but something that's not common is this error bound formula for your midpoint, trapezoidal, and the Simpson's rule. Okay, so basically, how does this vary? Okay, so if you check this out, this varies as a power of 2, h power 2. Okay, it's of the order of h power 2. Here you only take the second derivative and check it. Here it varies as the order of h power 3. Okay, and here it varies as an order of h power 4. So yeah, this is something that you will be learning in the 4th semester. Okay, so just keep these rules in mind. Okay, now let's move to the next question. Okay, so now I'm going to go a little slow in this because I've tried to get a little bit of feedback from people regarding this. Most of them have forgotten their BSc level group theory. Okay, so I'm going to go as slow as possible and help you understand. So if you have any questions, just stop me or raise your hand and I will answer for you. Okay, so G is a finite group of order n, where A belongs to G and order of A is M, if G is a cyclic group, then your M is equal to N is equal to 0, M is equal to N, M is greater than N, and M is less than N. So now we need to know what a group means, okay? So group is basically something that obeys a couple of postulates. What are those 4 postulates? You're looking at closure law, you're looking at distributive law, you're looking at existence of identity, existence of inverse. Okay, so that's a group. Now, what do you mean by cyclic group? Okay, so if I have something called a generator, I will be able to generate a set of cyclic subgroups. Okay, so let's look at this in the next slide. So if I have any element G, okay, where G is your generator in your group, one can form a subgroup of all the integer powers of that, okay? And those set are called cyclic subgroups of G. Now, so the order of G here is the number of elements in G, the group G, okay? So your generator generates some amount, and that should be equal to the same value as your cyclic group, okay? So the rest of them are cyclic subgroups. Whenever your number or your order of your generator is equal to the order of your cyclic group. So order of the group is basically the number of elements in the group. And this order of the generator is how many times this guy can repeat to give you different elements. Okay. So now let's go back and check this out. Okay. So here you have a finite group of order n. And what is A? A is basically your generator. Okay, so this guy is the generator. Okay, so it's going to generate that value for you so many number of times. Okay, and you're going to get unique elements in that group. So whenever the order, which is the number of elements in this group, is equal to the order of your generator, then you can say it's called a cyclic group. Okay, so now what do you have? Your M here, which is the order of your A, that is the order of the generator, should be equal to N, which is the number of elements in your group. Okay, so I've tried to kind of like explain it in like 4 minutes. I'm not so sure if people have got it, but please get back to me if you haven't. Okay, so this is basically repeating those elements. So what do you need in your group? You need an identity element. You need an inverse that exists. So you need a G inverse too. So this is how you basically denote your cyclic group. Okay, with a generator G. Okay. So now let's move on to question number 6. The set of non-singular square matrices of same order with respect to the matrix multiplication. So let's read it again. The set of all non-singular square matrices. What do you mean by non-singular? What do you mean by singular? Singular basically means the determinant of your matrix is going to be equal to 0. What do you mean by non-singular? The determinant of matrix is not equal to 0. And you're looking at square matrices. Okay, so you basically have the same order n cross n with respect to matrix multiplication is. Okay, so let's look at the options. Is it a quasi group? Is it a monoid? Is it a group? Is it a abelian group? So we've done this in our VSE, but I don't think people quite recall about it. So basically you need to know what these terms mean. Okay, so I told you what a group means: closure law, existence of identity, existence of inverse, and your distributive property, right? So let's look at this. Sorry, associative property, not distributive. Now let's look at this. Okay, so a group is basically, what does it obey? It obeys a closure property, associative property, identity element, and invertibility property or existence of inverse. So these 4 laws, I'm sure you would have done it in your BSc and you would have forgotten about it. You would have multiplied 2 cross 2 matrices and checked if, okay, fine, is it going to be in the set of those 2 cross 2 matrices? Then let me look at the associative. So does it obey the associative law? Is the LHS equal to the RHS? Then you would have looked at an identity element and you've tried to add or multiply. If it's a multiplication, you basically would have used an identity matrix and multiplied it with the matrix and checked if you got the same matrix back. So that's your identity. And then your invertibility, when does your invertibility property exist. Okay, when do you get an inverse? You basically get an inverse when you're going to have non-singular matrices. That is when your determinant is 0. So all the 4 properties exist, and this thing is going to be called a group. Okay, that's what you're going to come up with. So this is basically your homework for you. You're going to go and you're going to check if your set of non-singular 2 cross 2, or not 2 cross 2, here you have square matrices, so n cross n. Okay, n cross n matrices is a group under matrix multiplication. So this is the answer is C. But I will discuss what do you mean by a quasi group, which is also called your semi group, a monoid and abelian group. So if you look at your abelian group, it's basically all the properties of your group plus your commutative property. Okay, or if you look at your monoid, it's something that is lesser than that. Basically, in a monoid, it's everything that a group is except, let's just check 1 second. Yeah, okay. So if you have a monoid, it's everything except it does not have an inverse. Okay. If you look at your quasi group, it does not require identity element or inverses. Okay. And if you look at your abelian group, it has your, it's also your commutative group. So here, how can you write this? Okay, so if you have your closure property, basically if it is a quasi group, you have these two. Okay, if it is a monoid, they're going to have everything except your invertibility property. If it is a group, it's going to have all 4, and if it is a abelian group, it's going to have the commutative property too. Okay. So now let's move on. Okay. Okay. So we're coming back to cyclic groups. Okay. So all cyclic groups are abelian. The order of the cyclic group is the same as the order of the generator. So we've already done this. We know that statement B is true. Now all cyclic groups are abelian. Okay. So let's just check that out. Okay. So these are basically properties of cyclic groups. And I'm sure you would have proved them, but here we don't need to prove them. We just need to know the statement. So just put this in your head. All cyclic groups are abelian groups. Okay. So you'll realize that it's going to be option D. Okay. So every cyclic group is an abelian group. Okay. What do you mean by that? The group operation is commutative. And every finitely generated abelian group is a direct product of your cyclic groups. Okay, so just remember those are the properties of the statements. If I go on to do the proofs, this will never end. Okay. So now this is the order of a cyclic group is the same as the order of the generator. That's what we did before in the before question. Okay. So now I need to explain to you what you mean by isomorphism, what you mean by homomorphism. So I'm going to try and put this in extremely simple words. Okay. So what do you mean by homomorphism? Okay, so homomorphism is basically related to how 2 groups can be similar. Okay, isomorphism is basically related to how 2 groups are exactly the same. So this is exactly same and this is similar. Okay, so now let's move on to this. So both A and B are true. You will realize that both of them are true. You'll realize it's option A once I go back to it. So these are the options. Basically, it's going to ask you for 2 statements and ask you if they are true or false. Okay. So now let's look into this. Okay. So basically here, what are you doing? In homomorphism, you're looking at how similar 2 groups are. Okay. So I have a G operation, okay, with the star, and H with this diamond sort of symbol. And I have a function which goes from G to F. Okay. So this star is going to give you your G operation. This is going to give you your H operation. You should be very careful about that because either this could be plus, okay, this could be a plus or this could be a product. Okay, and I think you could probably try doing this for log of something like xy. Okay, so here you realize it's going to be a product, which is basically written as log of x plus log of y. Okay. So you have to be very careful with whatever groups that are given to you. Now, this kind of a form is called your homomorphism. Now, what is your isomorphism? Isomorphism basically is a homomorphism with 2 additional properties. One of them is your 1-to-1, and the other one is called your onto. Okay, so this we've done in PU. We have probably forgotten all of it. So I'm going to just give you a quick recap of it. So your homomorphism may not be one-to-one. Okay, your one-to-one is also known as an injection, and the other one is called maybe on not is your homomorphism is not onto. So onto is basically your surjection, and together with these things you have a bijection. So an isomorphism is a homomorphism that is one-to-one and onto, or a isomorphism is a homomorphism and a bijection. So what do you mean by one-to-one? Okay, so I will just show you a quick figure that tells you what one-to-one is. Okay, so this injective is basically one-to-one, and surjective is telling you onto. Okay, so if I look at this, this function is both one-to-one as well as onto. So every output here has a unique input here. Okay, so that is basically your one-to-one and onto situation. Now here, let's come back here. Okay, so you realize that D does not have any input. Okay, so such a function is a non-surjective. Okay, that means it's not onto, but it is one-to-one because every input that you give has a corresponding output. Okay, so let's talk about it in terms of inputs and outputs. That's I think more intuitive. Okay, so now let's look at this one. Okay, so the output here can have two inputs. Okay, so this is onto. Your all the outputs have a particular input, but it is not one-to-one because this inputs do not correspond to one and only one output. Okay, so your 3 can be C or your 4 can be C. Okay, so this is surjective and non-injective, or it is not one-to-one, but it is onto. Now this is a case where it's not one-to-one nor onto. Okay, so you have a couple of outputs here, okay, that do not have any corresponding input. You also have a situation where you have an output with two inputs. Okay, so this is not one-to-one, not onto. Okay, okay. So we were discussing about this. Okay, we were discussing about isomorphism and homomorphism. So what you realize that is, if I say that you can show that every isomorphic image of a cyclic group is cyclic, you realize that if it is a isomorphism, it's going to be a homomorphism. Okay, so you really don't, it's basically the same proof for both of them, except that this homomorphism that we describe, your function f will not be one-to-one and one-to in this case, but in this case it's going to be one-to-one and one-to. So it's basically the same proof, but it depends on how you describe your function f, which goes from a group G to a group H. Okay, so let's look at this. Okay, so let G be generated by A, and then you have G prime, which is an isomorphic or homomorphic image. Okay, I'm going to put that if you needed to prove it for a homomorphism. You do this, and then you look at the image of G under the isomorphism or homomorphism F. So basically, you're going from F, where you have G, to G prime. Okay. So then let's look at this. So the elements of G prime are the images of the elements of G under your function F. Now, if you have some function, say f of a power n, be any element of your G of G prime, so what do you have? You basically can factorize this into f of a. Okay, so you can get n factors. That's what you have here. Okay, and then we see that every element of your G prime can be expressed as an integral power of your f of a. So what happens? In this part, your generator was a. Okay, in this part, your generator was f of a. Okay, so the generators are now going to be, just a second. Okay, so this is basically your G prime is cyclic, and you have your f of a as the generator of G prime. Okay, so now this is something that you can probably answer. Try answering on your own. Okay, so if you have a one-to-one mapping of a finite group onto itself, what is it? Okay, is it an isomorphism, a homomorphism, an automorphism, or a monomorphism? So monomorphism is basically, so when you're looking at your isomorphism, what is it? Okay, it's a homomorphism plus you have a one-to-one and you have onto. Okay, so you basically have an injective function plus your surjective function. Okay. Now, homomorphism, I will just write it as H. What is an automorphism? Okay, so basically it is isomorphism that is onto itself. So basically it's going from G to G. Okay, what is your monomorphism? It's basically a homomorphism that is injective. So I'm going to write injective here. Okay. So now let's go and look at this. So what is it? It is an isomorphism that is from a mathematical object onto itself. Here the mathematical object is basically a group. Okay, so here look at the monomorphism, it's an injective homomorphism. Okay, so now we're done with group theory. We're going on to a little bit of classical mechanics along with some of electrodynamics. So this question is basically, it involves both principles from classical mechanics as well as electrodynamics. So I'm going to be giving you a derivation that you can check out. Okay, so the derivation is there in the PPT. When the material is like posted, you can check the derivation out. But for now, I'm going to tell you, okay, fine. Okay, I will start off by reading the question. So for a charged particle in an electromagnetic field, the canonical momenta are, okay, so these are the options that are given to you. Now, what you basically do when you want to find out the canonical momentum, you basically have your P in terms of a Lagrangian, which is given to you as dou L by dou Q dot. Okay, so this is a formula that you have to use, but you need a Lagrangian, and for that you need to look into a lot more of ED, your electrodynamics, and then proceed forth. Okay, so now this is how it's given. Your momentum here is described as dou L by dou Q dot. Now, I need you to look into the derivation of the Lagrangian on your own, okay, because we're like running out of time, I think. So you can look into the derivation of the Lagrangian on your own and then get back to me if you have any issues. So, okay, so these are velocity dependent potentials, but beware, here you have a C. Okay, so I realize that all the units are in CGS in the question. Okay, so you basically have to put a C here. And then you have your phi and your A, which are basically scalar and vector potentials. And then you have to do a lot of calculation. Okay, so you can read this through and check it out. And let me know if you understand it. If you don't, get back to me on it. Okay, so I'll stop at where I can find the Lagrangian. Okay, so this is my Lagrangian. Now, what do I need to do? Basically, all I need to do is end up, okay, it's probably good to remember this. Okay, it's a very common Lagrangian that is used. So let's do dou L by dou Q dot. Okay, so what is Q dot? Basically it means your V. Okay, so you want to find out what your canonical momentum means, right? So what do you have? You have a 2mv divided by 2 minus, what do you have a QV? No, you don't have, so you put a 0, and minus here you have a plus here, and you end up having 1 divided by C into A. Okay, so now you have a Q2 here, so you'll have to write the Q. Okay, so basically what you're going to get is, this is in CGS units. Remember that if it's not CGS units, you do not have this C. So MB plus QA vector divided by C is what you're getting. So that's basically your option B. Option A, sorry. So let's go back and look at the question. So what are you going to get? You're going to get MV plus QA divided by C. Okay, so look through the derivation, look through how the Lagrangian is obtained. I've done every single step, so it shouldn't be a problem. And then do that. Okay, so now let's look at this. A linear transformation of a generalized coordinate Q and the corresponding momentum P to Q and P, okay, is given by, okay, basically these are canonical transformations that you're looking at. So if they are canonical, they are going to give you something like this. Okay, so this is called your, okay, so I will write this. Different books have different notations. Okay, so different books have different notations, and I've tried to figure out a particular notation, but I think this is the one which is frequently used. But this is a notation that's used for your commutator, okay, in quantum mechanics, but here we are dealing with classical mechanics, so I think it should be fine. Okay, so you have a Q here and a P here. Okay, so if these are canonical transformations, you would have read about it and forgotten, so I ask you to go through them once more. Okay, so you're going to get a 1 here. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this Poisson bracket. Okay, I'm going to calculate this Poisson bracket. These are properties of your Poisson brackets, which you should have probably learned in your first semester for mechanics. Sorry, classical mechanics. So now let's look at this QP. Okay, so now you substitute Q plus P and Q plus alpha P. Okay, so I will put this bracket. Now what can I do? I can write Q, okay, plus Q alpha P. Okay, and now what I will do is I will write P, Q, and I will write P alpha P. Okay, so now what do I have? These two get cancelled. These two get cancelled because I have a Q and Q common, P and P common. When you end up doing your Poisson bracket, for which I'll give you the definition, you'll end up getting something like this. So now what do you have? This is going to be Q comma alpha P. So that's going to give you an alpha Q comma P. Plus you have a QP, PQ is equal to 1 is what you're going to get. So this guy gives you -1. This is an alpha. So -1 is equal to 1. So you get alpha is equal to 2. Okay. So now let's look at this. Okay, so what are the options that you have? You have an option D, which is 2. Okay, so this is the definition of your Poisson bracket. Okay, so how do you define it? If you have a Poisson bracket of A and B, you have a dou A by dou Q, dou B by dou P minus dou A by dou P, dou B by dou Q. So basically, how do you do it? Write A and B on top first. Okay, and then you write a QP and then shift it, PQ. So you have dou A by dou Q, dou B by dou P minus dou A divided by dou P and dou B by dou Q. Okay, so now let's move on. So what are you looking at? If you have canonical coordinates Q and P, you end up getting a Poisson bracket of 1. That's what you realize. So these two get cancelled, you get 1. These two get cancelled, you get 1. But this is a 0, so you end up getting a 1. So this is the calculation of that. You can go through it. I've already done it once for you. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. The value of the Poisson bracket A dot R, B dot P, where A and B are constant vectors is, okay? So this is the same calculation, but here instead of your Q, you put a vector R, and instead of just a P, you put a vector P. Okay, so now you realize that they have put vectors here and they put vectors here, but they haven't put any vectors here. It's option D, but they should have put vectors here too in the options. Okay, so let's look at this. What do you have? You have a dou A by dou Q and dou B by dou P minus dou A by dou P, dou B by dou Q, and then you substitute the value of A and B that you had. So you had an A dot R, you had a B dot P. Okay, you substitute it, you realize that these go to 0, and then you have an A dot B at the end. So it's option D. That's what you had before. So let's look at the options again. You have an option D. They should have put a vector here. Okay. So now this, so when you're looking at canonical, these are also called contact transformation. You're going from your old set of coordinates to a new set of coordinates. So you're basically going from a P to Q, Q and P to a big Q and a big P. That's what you're doing. Okay, in contact transformations or canonical transformations, that's what you're doing. You're going from a little p, little q to a big P, big Q. Okay, so here when you're looking at this, the canonical transformation corresponding to this generating function. Okay, so I will talk about a little bit of generating functions, and then I will tell you about what they actually mean by this identity transformation. So I'm going to ask you to solve another question first and then get back to you on this. Okay, so prove that the generating function summation of I, Qi, Pi generates the identity transformation. Okay, so let's look at this. So here the generating function, I hope you remember this. This was from your first semester classical mechanics. You had 4 generating functions, F1, F2, F3, and F4. Okay, so basically this guy was a function of Q, and okay, so let me write this way. Okay, so this is how I write my functions so that I can remember them easily. I have a QQ, I have a PP, and then I have a QP, QP. What you're supposed to realize is the generating function relates one old variable and one new variable. Okay, so a T, 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 T. Okay, so that's how I remember the generating functions, and once you remember them, everything else comes automatically. Okay, So I have an F2 which is equal to summation of I, Qi, Pi. So now I want to find out what my Pi is, okay? So if I need to find out what my Pi is, basically I know that F2 has a function of Q and P, okay? Q and P. So I know that I'm supposed to be taking a derivative of F with respect to Q. And I also know that I'm supposed to be taking a derivative of F2 with respect to big P. Okay, so I know that. So if I'm getting a Q, I know I'm supposed to be knowing that I'm going to get a little p, okay? If I get a big P here, I'm supposed to be getting a big Q here. Okay, so that's how I remember it, okay? Because deriving it and then equating it to this partial derivatives that you get, it's quite intense, and I don't think I can cover it in so much time. I've almost like gone out of time today. Okay, so you realize that you have a PI and you have a QI, okay? So now when your PI is equal to your big PI and your QI is equal to your big QI is when you say you have identity transformation. So your old coordinates map exactly to your new coordinates. That's when you have identity transformations. So what you'll realize here is, okay, so going back to this, okay, so now why have they given little pi and little qi? Okay, so what happens when you substitute, what I told you was the old and the new coordinates exactly map to, the old coordinates exactly map to the new coordinates, right? So even if I substitute the old coordinates here, this is going to give me an identity transformation. Okay, so the generating function is usually supposed to have, an old variable and new variable. But this case, since it's an identity transformation, it's going to have, you can have either both old variables or both new variables. Okay, so this is option A. Now, another thing that I'd like to show you is a table. Okay, so there is a table here, and okay, so I told you how to remember these functions: QQ, PP, QP, and QP. Okay, so now here, if you're looking at this, you have a function of Q and little q and capital Q. So dou F1 divided by dou Q1 should give you a little pi. And then you have a capital Pi, which is going to give you a negative sign. So how I remember this is, it's confusing, but try to, if you have a little p in the denominator, then you take a negative sign. If you have a big Q in the denominator, take a negative sign, okay? If you have a big Q in the denominator, take a negative sign. If you have a little p in the denominator, take a negative sign, okay? So these are the simplest case forms, okay? You can go through it and tell me if you, and you can get back to me if you have any issues on this one. Okay, so now let's go on to the 14th question. Which one of the following is not the generating function of the canonical transformation P is equal to 1 by Q and Q is equal to PQ squared? Okay, so now we looked at this, right? We looked at this. Now, what I will tell you to do is work from the answers backwards. Okay, this is a question that is wrong because they've given not. Okay, and not just that, they've messed up this symbol. So, what I'm gonna do is, okay, so let me look at this function, first function that I have. So I know that F1 is a function of Q and Q, and I have a T here. So let me take dou F1 divided by dou Q, should give me a P, and let me take a dou F1 divided by dou Q, which should give me a capital Q. But what did I say? If you have a big Q, you put a negative sign. If you have a big Q in the denominator, put a negative sign. If you have a little p in the denominator, put a negative sign. Okay, little p's, big Q's. That's what you're supposed to remember. So now I will put a negative sign here. Okay, and what I will do is I will erase all this. Okay, so now let's calculate this. What was given to you? Okay, so let's work from the options backwards. Okay, so you have a Q by Q. Okay, so if I take the derivative of this with respect to Q, what do I get? I get a 1 by Q. Okay, so basically what does that give me? That gives me little p is equal to 1 divided by Q. Next one that I have is I take a partial differential with respect to capital Q. So I get up getting a minus, but I'm doing a dou by dou Q of Q divided by Q. So what's that going to give me? That's going to give me a minus Q divided by Q squared. So that's going to give me a Q divided by Q squared. Okay, so what do I get? Little p is equal to 1 divided by Q, and I get a big P which is equal to a little q divided by big Q squared. So I get a little q equal to PQ squared. Okay, so this and this is what I'm supposed to have here, but this was a question with a wrong answer. The answer key said the answer was wrong. Okay, one, because they said which is not the generating function. Okay, two, they've said that this is supposed to be actually a little p, not a big P. Okay, now how do I rule out if these two are not generating functions? You got same coordinates. Okay, you've got same coordinates here. You've got p, both p and p coming up, which is big, both capital P's. That means there's a new coordinates. What about these things? These two are new coordinates. Okay, you've got a big Q and a capital P coming up. So what do? These are new coordinates. So you can rule this out directly. Now the only thing that you have to check is this. Okay, 2 root of QP, and do that as a homework and get back to me on it. Okay. So this question is wrong. Okay, so this is a wrong question. Again, the quickest method here too is to work from the options and backwards rather than trying to find the generating function from the transformations that have been given to you. Okay, so let's look at this. Which of the following statements is false? The Poisson bracket of momentum conjugate to a cyclic coordinate with Hamiltonian vanishes. Okay, let's elaborate on all these. The Lagrangian bracket is invariant under canonical transformations. Poisson bracket changes sign under commutation of the concerned dynamical variables. Lagrangian bracket is commutative with respect to the concerned dynamical variables. Okay, so okay, so let's look at this now. Let's look at what your Lagrangian bracket means. Okay, so here, just a second. Okay, so let's look at what your Lagrangian bracket actually means. Okay, so let's do this. Let's look at this. Definition of your Lagrangian brackets here. The Lagrangian bracket of two dynamical variables, f and g, is defined as, okay, so you've got this, you've got an f and a g. Now, it's not the same as your Poisson brackets. So if you look at your Poisson brackets, your f and g were on top. Here, what's happening is that both are, like at the bottom. Okay, so your functions here are at the bottom, and the coordinates p and q are at the top. Now, the Lagrangian bracket does not obey the commutative law for algebra that for your Lagrangian brackets. Okay, so you're getting inverse here, so you automatically know that's your option D when you're looking at it. So commutative with respect to the concerned dynamical variables, it's not commutative, and they've asked which of the following statements is false. Okay, so they're looking at this, so you know it's option D automatically. Now let's just look into the other stuff that you have. Okay, so here the Lagrangian brackets do not depend on the system of canonical coordinates. If PQ is another system of canonical coordinates, so that Q is equal to Q of QP and P is equal to P of QP is a canonical transformation, then the Lagrange bracket is an invariant of the transformation. So that, what does that mean? Basically your U and V, okay, if you have a U and V, or your P and Q in the first system and your V and U and V in the second system, you're basically finding that is going to be equal. Okay, so that's what your second line means here. Lagrangian bracket is invariant under canonical transformations. It does not change when you transform your coordinates from P to Q and Q to P. Okay, so I think this is the last question for today. I think I've overstepped on the time a little bit. I think about 6 minutes more. So what I want to do next is I want to do the next two problems that I have. One is on counters and the other one is on registers. So I want to do that next. So I've send a link of the video on the group. So I'd like you to look at it once, look through as many different types of counters and registers as you can, so that I can do it. And one more thing is that these things that I told you about, uh, these things called your, what are they? Your transformations, okay? So these things have to be really worked out and remembered. So these are some things that you can forget easily. So it's probably better to actually to find a trick to remember them, like how I showed you, or like this little p's and big q's. Now, if you want the derivation for it, I can give it to you. But the whole point of doing this exercise is not to go in depth into the notations. Another thing, group theory terms like isomorphism, homomorphism, abelian group, monoid, cyclic group, all those kinds of things have to be like remembered. You just have to remember the terminologies, the different theorems that there are. Okay, so you should probably look into your group theory from your BSc. Just look at just the definitions. Don't look at the proofs, definitions and statements of the theorems. Okay, so after this, I'm planning to do, okay, so a couple of people asked me uh, if I have a system where I have actually categorized which topic is more important, like which paper is more important, like if it's a classical mechanics paper, it's a classical mechanics, quantum mechanics, so many questions from quantum mechanics for each paper. So I'm trying to do a paper analysis as I go along. But the thing that you realize here is even in this set of papers, that the electrodynamics question had two components to it. So basically I had to apply some classical mechanics to this electrodynamics Lagrangian that I got. So basically it's like remembering something from electrodynamics and using classical mechanics. So it's really hard to categorize those kind of problems. So I'm trying to figure out a way to do that. So probably by the end of, like solving all these papers, I should be able to give you a paper analysis or which questions are more. Probably you could try it, but I don't think the paper analysis is quite worth looking at, because I remember wasting a lot of time on just looking at these paper analysis things and deciding, okay, fine, I will do classical mechanics. The thing is, you need to be, you need to train your brain in order to shuffle from one concept to the next. So I think this is the best way to go about it. And the last thing I'm trying to do is get a formula sheet. Okay, so like actually sit and write down the formulas that are very common and frequent. But I don't know if I'll be able to do that. Let's see how things go.